I didn't move into that house to start over. I moved there to disappear, to escape the constant echoes of my past, the hollow whispers of judgment that had followed me through every hallway of my old life. The suffocating reminder of a marriage that had ended not with a bang but with quiet betrayal and the cold indifference of someone who once promised forever. After the divorce, after losing the life I thought I had built, I needed silence, not the polite kind of quiet you find in a city at 2 in the morning, but the kind that presses down on you, forcing you to sit with yourself and confront everything you've been running from, and the house at the end of that narrow street seemed to promise exactly that. A sanctuary of solitude wrapped in peeling paint and ivy that clung stubbornly to the brick walls like memories that refused to die, its windows staring blankly as if daring me to step inside and leave my past behind. The previous owner, a man named Kareem, had been eager to sell, too eager, a rush that should have warned me, but desperation has a funny way of blinding you, making you sign papers with a hand that trembles not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally escaping. And I moved in within 3 days, hauling boxes through a squeaking front gate, feeling the weight of my entire life pressed against the floors. Each room an empty canvas I intended to paint over with the colors of new beginnings. The first night in that house was strange, not terrifying. But there was a presence, a sense that the walls themselves were watching, that the silence was not my own, that some invisible eyes might be following me as I unpacked, arranged, and rearranged furniture in a desperate attempt to assert ownership over a space that felt almost sentient, and I tried to convince myself it was normal, that trauma makes you feel shadows breathe, that my imagination was simply reclaiming its territory after months of being silenced by grief. The days passed and I began to settle, breathing again, sleeping again, painting over old marks on the walls, slowly allowing the house to feel like mine, until, exactly 1 week after I had signed the papers, my phone rang. An unknown number flashing across the screen, a hesitation in my chest warning me not to answer, but instinct pushed me to pick it up, and when a calm but strangely tense male voice said, "Hi, this is Kareem, the previous owner," something inside me froze, a shiver that I couldn't explain running down my spine, because nothing about the call felt ordinary, and I tried to sound casual, to mask the unease creeping into my voice as I asked, "Oh, is everything okay?" And then he paused, long enough for the silence to settle like dust in the air, before finally confessing, "Listen, I forgot to disconnect something," and my heart sank, though I didn't yet understand why, a primal warning that something was terribly wrong, and I asked slowly, carefully, "What do you mean?" And he explained that a security camera in the living room had never been disconnected, that it was still linked to his old system, still capable of transmitting live footage directly to him, that he had only just remembered and was now telling me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't form words as the weight of realization hit me like a physical blow, that every private moment I had spent in that living room since moving in might have been observed, recorded, watched by a man I barely knew. And when I demanded, disbelief shaking my voice, "You're telling me you've been able to see inside my house this entire week?" he replied hurriedly, almost pleading, "I didn't watch. I swear. I just realized it today," but I couldn't trust him, not a word, because the proof was already planted in my mind. Each night I had passed that corner, now a memory tainted by exposure, every laugh, every tear, every quiet moment of solitude potentially a performance for someone else's eyes, and the anger started to bubble even through the cold dread, because even if he hadn't actively watched, the mere fact that he could have violated the sanctuary I had fought so hard to claim, and I realized that this house, my supposed refuge, was no longer a place of healing, but a stage for betrayal I hadn't even known was possible, and I ended the call shaking, staring at the ceiling where the camera supposedly watched, wondering how someone could so casually strip away your sense of privacy, your right to feel safe in your own home. And as I sank onto the sofa, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls, I felt a mix of fear and determination settle in me, a realization that the silence I had sought might have been an illusion, but that I could reclaim. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house sounded louder than it should, every shadow seemed to slither just a fraction closer, and the walls I had begun to call my own now felt like eyes pressing in on me, suffocating me with their silence, and I found myself pacing from room to room, staring at every corner, every ceiling nook, every angle where a camera could be hiding, trying desperately to convince myself that he hadn't watched, that maybe it was true, that he had simply Forgotten, yet the gnawing doubt in my chest refused to be silenced, twisting into anger and fear in equal measure, because how could someone forget a camera in their house, a house they no longer lived in, and yet have the capability to see everything I did, to witness the intimate details of my life without permission, without warning, and every step I took across the wooden floors now felt like it had been traced, monitored, catalogued, and the thought made my stomach churn violently, forcing me to clutch my sides as nausea and panic coiled inside me, and at 2:13 a.m., my phone buzzed, the vibration cutting sharply through the quiet, and when I looked, it was an unknown number again, and before I could think, I answered, voice trembling despite my attempt at calm, hello, and there it was, that same calm voice, eerily casual yet carrying an undercurrent of control. I told you I wasn't watching. The message attached a screenshot, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Because it was me, in the living room, in my pajamas, the dim lamp casting a soft glow across the walls, frozen in a moment I thought had been private, and suddenly every laugh, every sigh, every movement over the past week replayed in my mind like surveillance footage, and I understood in that instant that he had lied, that the truth had been masked in a casual tone, in a confession that seemed half-hearted but carried the weight of manipulation, and I called him immediately, trembling, voice sharp with accusation, you lied to me. And he answered almost too quickly, too smoothly, I didn't lie. I said I wasn't watching before. But now, I can't help it, and the words made my chest tighten, the air thick with dread, as if the house itself was holding its breath alongside me, and my voice wavered as I demanded, what do you want? And after a pause long enough to feel like an eternity, he said, you remind me of her, and my throat went dry, a cold knot forming there that refused to loosen. Of who? I asked cautiously, the shadows in the corners suddenly sharper, darker, as if leaning in to listen, and he continued softly, almost reverently, my wife. She used to stand in that same spot before she left me, and my stomach dropped, a slow, sinking feeling of dread, because in that moment, it wasn't just a camera, it wasn't just intrusion, it was history, obsession, a pattern I had stepped into unknowingly, and I felt trapped, watched, manipulated, every instinct screaming at me to run, yet I couldn't, because the walls were mine, the house was supposed to be my refuge, and yet now it felt like a cage, and I forced myself to breathe, to steady my shaking hands, as anger began to simmer beneath the fear, a fire igniting that made the cold feel almost bearable, and I said firmly, I'm disconnecting that camera, and he replied not loudly, not aggressively, but with a certainty that made my skin crawl, you won't, and that one word echoed through my mind, bouncing off the walls, infiltrating my thoughts, until I realized he might be right, that the invisible threads of control he had wrapped around me were tighter than I'd imagined. And fear twisted into fury, a fierce determination settling in my chest, because I wasn't going to be a pawn, a curiosity, or a substitute for someone else's obsession, and I spent the rest of the night imagining every possible way to take back control, to turn this violation into power, to ensure that the next time he thought he had access, he would find nothing but my awareness, my preparation, my unyielding will, and I began to plan quietly, meticulously, every step I would take, knowing that fear was temporary but strategy, patience, and cunning could change everything, and as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, painting the walls in muted gold, I finally allowed myself a shaky breath, a tiny measure of relief, because I had survived the night, because I had begun to transform fear into action, because even though the walls had watched me, even though someone had penetrated the sacred space of my solitude, I realized that the fight had just begun, and that once I was ready, the tables would turn, and the eyes that had haunted me would see nothing but the consequence of their intrusion, and in that quiet, terrifying, exhilarating moment, I understood that I was no longer just a victim in this story, but the architect of the next chapter, and the living room, once a space of betrayal, would become the stage of my reclaiming. By morning, the fear that had gripped me the night before had shifted into something sharper, something hotter, a simmering fire that spread through my chest and made my hands shake not with panic but with determination, because I realized that fear was temporary, but what I did with it could define me, and he thought he had power over me, that his knowledge of my every move, every small vulnerability, every unguarded moment had made me weak, but he had underestimated something fundamental. Don't stay broken, I rebuild, stronger, smarter, quieter, and I wouldn't let anyone, hold dominion over my life, so I played along, pretending to be unsettled, vulnerable, sitting in the living room in the dim light as if weighed down by the invisible gaze, speaking aloud as though I had no plan, knowing that each word he heard would give him a false sense of control, while I plotted quietly, calculating each step, each subtle maneuver, letting him think he had my trust when in reality I was mapping his every move, every weakness, and while I spoke, I began gathering resources, hiring a technician discreetly, having him inspect the house from top to bottom under the guise of routine maintenance. And little by little I uncovered the truth about the cameras, not just the one in the living room, but hidden cameras in other rooms, small, almost invisible, designed to capture every intimate detail. And I felt a chill as I realized the extent of his intrusion, but instead of despair, I felt resolve harden into steel. I asked the technician to trace the feed, to locate the IP addresses, to document everything, and within days I had what I needed: recordings, data, traces leading straight back to him, and the knowledge that I could now turn this invasion into leverage, into control. And as I held the files in my hands, I felt a strange thrill, a dark satisfaction, because for the first time since moving in, I was not the observed, I was the observer, the one who had the power to make the invisible visible, the one who could expose, confront, and take back what had been stolen. And I began to craft the narrative, the confrontation, the reversal of roles. Imagining the moment I would speak into the camera, knowing he would be watching, his sense of superiority shattered the moment I revealed that I had known all along, that the vulnerability he assumed was real was nothing but a carefully constructed mask. And I rehearsed my words, my tone, my timing, because sweet revenge is in the precision, in the silence before the storm, and I allowed myself to think of him not as a human being but as a cautionary tale, a reflection of what happens when someone mistakes curiosity for control, obsession for love. And I planned everything down to the smallest detail: when I would reveal my knowledge, how I would manipulate the situation so he would panic, how I would ensure that the consequences were inescapable, and all the while, I maintained the illusion of ordinary life, moving through the house, arranging furniture, smiling when I spoke to him, letting him think he was still in charge, while in reality, the tide had shifted, the balance of power had quietly, irreversibly, moved in my favor. And with each passing day, I felt my confidence grow, my sense of justice sharpen, my patience deepen, because I understood that this was no longer just about reclaiming privacy. It was about reclaiming dignity, proving that I would not be a silent victim. And when I finally spoke to him again, I did so from a position of strength, knowing that every word, every pause, every carefully timed statement would send him into the panic, the fear, the desperation he had once tried to impose on me. And the thought thrilled me, made my pulse quicken, because there is a unique satisfaction in watching someone who believed they controlled you realize that control was an illusion. And as the week wore on, I meticulously plotted the final act, coordinating with authorities discreetly, ensuring that when the time came, he would find that his obsession had not only been discovered but that it would bring him consequences he could not escape. And I visualized the moment he would look around the house, seeing it ordinary and peaceful, unaware that every camera had been traced, every feed logged, every violation documented. And in that quiet triumph, I felt something I hadn't in years: power, clarity, and the undeniable truth that I was no longer prey, no longer watched, no longer a passive player in someone else's story. And I smiled to myself in the dim light of the living room, imagining the shock on his face, the panic creeping into his voice, the realization that the carefully constructed fortress of his control had been dismantled not with noise or confrontation, but with patience, intelligence, and an unwavering refusal to remain a victim. And I knew then that fear had been only the beginning, the spark that ignited a fire strong enough to consume the violation he had attempted, leaving only the satisfaction of reclamation, of quiet, inevitable, and perfect revenge. Because by the time he realized what had happened, the game would already be over, and I would have won. The night I decided it was over, I felt a calmness I hadn't known since I first stepped into that house, a quiet power that settled in my chest like armor, because everything had been set in motion, every detail accounted for, every step rehearsed and executed with precision. And I sat in the living room, the space that had once felt like a prison now my throne, knowing he was watching, that his obsession had led him straight into my hands, and I allowed myself to speak aloud, casually, almost playfully, "You're quiet tonight," and immediately my phone buzzed, his response instant, "I'm listening," and I smiled, though he couldn't see it, because the fear I felt before had transformed into a thrill, a dark, sweet satisfaction, and I leaned back in the sofa, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build, knowing he believed he was in control, while in truth, I had orchestrated every moment leading up to this, every movement, every word, every heartbeat, and I spoke again. Soft, deliberate, "You told me I remind you of your wife," and his voice was caught mid-response, betraying the first hint of unease. "Yes," he said, clipped, defensive, and I leaned closer to the camera, letting my eyes glint with a cold certainty. What happened to her? And the pause was delicious, stretching longer than it had any right to, his breath catching as he tried to regain composure. The man who had once watched me so closely now hesitant, unsure, and I continued, almost whispering. "She left, didn't she?" And the reaction was immediate, a crack in his armor, a subtle but unmistakable tremor in his voice. He stammered, and I interrupted, steady, controlled, "No. She escaped. And so will anyone who tries to invade what is mine," and I heard it then, the first sirens, distant but unmistakable, the faintest wail of approaching justice, and I let it sink in, letting every syllable, every word, every breath of his panic reach me through the camera, knowing that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the culmination of fear transformed into strategy, of anger refined into precision. And I told him, calmly, deliberately, "I think you should look outside," and he did. I imagined it, and his voice cracked, rising in panic. "What did you do?" And I smiled wider, though he couldn't see it. "I stopped being afraid," I said, letting the words linger like a knife in the dark. And the police arrived moments later, lights flashing through the windows, authority filling the space he had once occupied in my mind, and I watched him, imagined him, scrambling, realizing too late that the power he had assumed was gone, every camera traced, every feed logged, every intrusion documented, and there was no escape, no bargaining, only consequence, and I ended the call, the phone cold in my hand, and for the first time in a week, the house was silent, truly silent. But this silence was not heavy, not oppressive, it was peaceful, victorious, the kind of quiet that allows you to breathe freely again, and I rose from the sofa, walking through the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, checking every corner, every angle where a camera had once been, removing the remnants of intrusion with deliberate care, repainting walls, moving furniture slightly, letting the space reclaim its own presence, as if exhaling after a long captivity, and the sunlight streamed in through the windows, warm and forgiving, filling the house with life rather than fear, and I opened every curtain, letting the light sweep across the floors, a symbolic reclaiming of territory, of freedom, and I felt it deeply, the thrill of vindication, the sweetness of watching someone who thought they could control you realize that they never had, that they had underestimated your resilience, your intelligence, your patience. And I realized that revenge was not in shouting or confrontation but in preparation, in quiet power, in patience that outlasted the arrogance of obsession, and as I stood in the center of the living room, breathing in the light, the house truly mine at last, I understood something essential. Fear had been only the first step, the spark that ignited strength. The catalyst that allowed me to reclaim what was stolen and to take something far more valuable than privacy, control, dignity, and the knowledge that I could never again be a victim. And in that quiet triumph, in that perfect alignment of planning, patience, and justice, I smiled fully, freely, because the chapter was closed, the story rewritten, and the house, once a place of shadows and watching eyes, was now a sanctuary, a fortress, a home, bathed in sunlight, and I was finally, irreversibly free.